Hello and welcome to the HCAN Connection. Today we're going to be talking all about attending conferences. So how to make the most out of your experience, some of the do's and don'ts, the things that you wouldn't know unless you've either been to a conference or somebody is here to tell you. So we're here to talk about some of those things today, and maybe be the ones to tell you if you haven't heard some of these things before. My name is Katie Brinker. I'm your host today. I'm the chair of the PR and Comms Committee of HCAN. And I'm also a longtime volunteer of IEEE and HCAN in general, including some conference organizing type volunteering. Beyond that, I have a PhD in electrical engineering. So today I'm going to be kind of talking from the perspective of both somebody who's attended a lot of conferences and somebody who's helped organize some conferences. And then with us today, we also have Amy Michael, the HCAN program manager, and she's going to be our guest and help us discuss this topic. So welcome to the podcast, Amy. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if to start with, you could maybe give us a little bit of information kind of on your background, some of your
Sure.
experience with working with students and going to conferences, those kind of things.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And I'm very happy to be here. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because, like you, I've attended a lot of conferences, and I'm now in my role as the HKN program manager responsible for helping to organize all of the HKN conferences. Prior to coming to HKN, I worked at Rutgers University overseeing student service programs. And in that role, I would take students to national student leadership conferences for like about 10, 15 years. So I'd like to say I've seen it all, but there's always new things. So it's great to be here.
Great, thank you so much. So I think maybe let's start from the beginning. So when there's a conference that comes up, the first thing that you're going to kind of need to figure out is your travel plans. That is if it's an in-person conference. We'll talk a little bit more about virtual conferences later, but so for in-person conferences, making your travel plans, do you have any recommendations for, kind of where people should start or, some do's and don'ts, tips and tricks? What would you say is kind of a good starting place for figuring out travel?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that you need to take into consideration is to plan on being at the conference for the whole conference, right? Like, you're going to be taking time out of your normal schedule. It's a unique opportunity. You're going to be seeing people, like-minded people from all over the world in the case of like HKN conferences. And so you really want to maximize your time. And that means planning around the fact that you are going to be there for the whole conference. So typically, and I'll use the upcoming student leadership conference as an example, they tend to start like registration around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's even sessions starting, 3 or 4 o'clock,
Yeah.
that you don't want to miss, right? So I think if you start from there and then you kind of back your way up and build in to the fact that there's delays, especially nowadays, if you're flying, there's a lot of delays, oftentimes. Um, and so I would start by going kind of backwards from there. So, typically, even when you land, you have to think about the time it takes for you to get to the airport, the time that it takes to get from the airport to your, hotel destination, and
Yeah.
you also need to just build in some time. You're in a new place. You have to get, you're kind of a little bit um, acclimated and get your bearings, and all of that takes a little bit of time. You don't want to feel like you're rushing, and you don't want to feel
Yeah.
like that stress. So that, I think, on the front end,
Mm-hmm.
and the same thing I think would be true on the other end, and using SLC, continuing to use as an example, like that conference will end around noon, and so you need to leave time to get to the airport, to get to the couple hours so that you're
Yeah.
there comfortably and allow for traffic and mishaps and things like that. So you want to build enough of a cushion like around the time of the actual conference.
Yeah.
When when I would take students, and again, this is also depending on your budget and your um, how much money you have. I also look at like, where am I going to be? When am I going to be in Houston, Texas again? So what is it that I can do, you know, like to build like maybe an extra day and actually have a chance to visit
Yeah.
something of note there. So
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that's all really great advice. And I think another kind of aspect too on the tail end, on the leaving side, something I've seen before from students or people attending conferences is being a little bit unsure of how to navigate hotel checkout times versus conference end times. And so, I think kind of the traveler's trick of the trade is that you can have your hotel hold your luggage even after you check out. So I do that all the time. Make sure I just kind of like, my flight's not until 4 p.m., conference ends around noon. Well, I won't be back into my room before hotel checkout time, so I'll just check out in the morning before breakfast, have the hotel hold my luggage. I can do my thing all day at the conference and then pick it up at the concierge desk before I have to, take a taxi to the airport. And so then you're not missing out on that last day of the conference. You're not worried about, overstaying your time, going past the checkout time, all that stuff. That's kind of a trick of the trade that that you can use and build into your planning. And people do it all the time. I do it all the time. And then I think too, especially if you're having to travel a long way, like you said, building in kind of that buffer zone is especially helpful. I've been to some academic conferences outside of the US. It's not very fun to get to the other side of the world at like 1 in the morning the night before the conference starts. You're jet lagged, you're tired, you still have to try to be engaged all the next day. So if you can build in an extra day to kind of acclimate, or get there a little extra early, have some buffer time, that's always helpful.
yeah, that's a great point too, with all the time differences and jet lag.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so we've kind of talked about getting to the conference, but once you're at the conference, and I think this kind of ties in a little bit to the pre-planning, the packing aspect. So, what do you wear while you're at a conference? How do you make sure that you look the part, you don't stand out for the wrong reasons, I guess you could say. Um, what would you say is kind of the dress code norms at conferences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even though you might be a student, you need to think of yourself attending a conference as a pre-professional or professional. So you're not going to necessarily dress the same way you would if you were going to class. So you want to not look like you just rolled out of bed. Not that anybody does that before class, but you want to make sure that you're presenting yourself in a professional manner. So, but you also want to be comfortable too. Like I think that that's okay. And so most conferences now are business casual. So if you have, shirt a shirt with sleeves and a collar, it could be a polo shirt. You could have a polo shirt and like khakis, and still look, like business like. And same thing for you know the I would say that is especially good for like maybe when you first get there. um you might want to, if there's a career fair or something, you might want to step up your game a little bit when you're going to be attending a career fair and have a jacket or something that you can put over it. Um, and if there's, a dinner or something that's more like social in nature, like a lot of times there might be like, a banquet or something. And then in that case, you might want to, um, dress up a little bit, like something a little bit more. fancy for like a going out type of attire. But one thing that
Yeah.
I avoid, is like flip flops or I mean, I've seen students and you're like, oh my God, you're shaking your head. They come with like they're on sweatpants and they're or like really short tops, like with their midriff exposed and things like that, which is fine for, casual wear, but not at a conference. At a conference, you're meeting professionals, you're representing your school. First of all, I think it's good to put that in your mind too. And people are, forming an impression not only of you but your school, your chapter. So, you can't go wrong by being overdressed, but you can go wrong in the other direction, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's that balance of comfort and professionalism. Like I think shoes are a really good example of that. My very first career fair as a freshman in college, I wore heels to the career fair and my feet were so blistered and bruised and it was horrible. And after that I was like, I'm never doing this ever again. I can wear nice flat shoes that look nice but are comfortable. So kind of keep that in mind too. You may have to walk a little bit from your hotel to where the sessions are being held, or walk a couple minutes over to where a dinner is or a reception or things like that. So just kind of keep in mind, you know you're probably going to be wearing those shoes all day and going from session to session and place to place. So I think that's kind of a good tip or a good thing to keep in mind. And then too, I think, you know, if you are going to carry a backpack, keep in mind that you are carrying it pretty much all day. So, there's kind of pros and cons to that. You can have your tablet with you or your notebook with you or something like that. Usually I just carry like my purse and a small notebook that fits inside of it. And then it's easy to kind of pull that out, jot down a couple notes, jot down somebody's name, but I'm not too like bogged down by a whole backpack that I have to deal with at dinner and stuff like that.
Right. Plus, you're like whacking people with it in line.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And so, yeah, I think that now kind of brings us to the next part of a conference attendance experience. And that's really like planning out your agenda and, what you're going to do when you get there. You're there to make the most. You paid for it, you traveled there a lot of the times.
Mhm.
How do you kind of maximize the value you get out of being there? So, do you have any tips for kind of like planning out your sessions or what you want to go to? Like, how would you approach that decision process of, okay, I have all these sessions in front of me, maybe even parallel multiple tracks? What do you pick? How do you navigate that?
Right. I think it depends a lot on if you're there alone or with maybe just one other person versus if you're there with a group. And especially when there's tracks and usually a conference is just like jam packed and it goes by really fast and you have to be super intentional to get the most out of it. So what I would recommend is, prior to even going, there's a website. Usually there's a conference website that lists what the content's going to be. So, taking a look at that for sure. And maybe even like looking up who is speaking. It's like when you're picking classes, you realize who's the professor matters a lot compared to, maybe the topic. Like if it's the person, like to make sure you know who is actually um, doing it. So if there are multiple tracks, like try to have like a mix of that. And if you're going with a group, make sure that you're like planning that out together so that, among the group, you're covering the tracks so that you're not, the worst thing I think would be is everybody just kind of sticking together and going, like all to the same sessions,
Mm-hmm.
because maybe that's like what you think you'll be most comfortable doing. you need to like push yourself out of that comfort zone and
Yeah.
and make sure that you're splitting up and coming together and sharing, but but having that discussion with whomever you're attending with. Now, if you're alone, then I think you can, make sure that you're choosing sessions that are going to a interest you, be be useful to you with your future career and all of that, and making sure you have a good mix of prep.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also kind of think it depends partially on the length of the conference as well. If it's something like the HCAN Student Leadership Conference where you have the like Friday evening, full day Saturday, Sunday morning, trying to make sure that you're finding something to go to in every session, I think is really important for maximizing that experience. But if you're at a conference that's like a week long technical conference, well, maybe there's one session on Thursday that, you look at both parallel technical tracks and you're like, this isn't really my cup of tea. And maybe that's a good time to kind of like recharge a little bit and do something else that you want to do while you're in that city. So I think it really depends on the length. At the same time, you don't want to, play hooky or just go play tourist the whole time because you are there for a reason. You're there to learn and to develop yourself and, make connections, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think kind of navigating, if this is a full week, it's pretty exhausting to be there from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day trying to absorb technical information. So, you can kind of, figure out what works best for you while still maximizing the experience. I think another thing that's important is just kind of reading the fine print. So a lot of times with conferences, they'll maybe have an app or they'll send out emails to attendees in the mornings. Just making sure that you open that up and look through it. Maybe there was a room change, or maybe, breakfast is delayed by 15 minutes for some reason. These kind of things happen, and just making sure that you're on top of it is really good. You don't want to miss out just because you didn't bother to open the app or read that notification in the morning and now you can't find the session you really wanted to go to. So I think that's important. And then on the technical side as well, something I've seen is a lot of times there's rules around presenting your papers and stuff like that. So like for poster sessions, for example, if you're not there to present your poster, maybe you just hang up your poster and then you go walk away and you don't attend your poster session to present it, your paper may not be published. So, making sure that you understand the rules of the road there and, what you have to do to make sure that your paper is published when you're going to a technical conference. I think that's one that gets people sometimes. So paying attention to the fine print, I think, is kind of really important.
What's your take on you think the session is going to be about something and then that you're really interested in, you get there and it's really not what you thought it would be. What's your take on walking out in the middle of a session?
So I would say it depends on the format of the session. If it's a keynote that's like an hour long, I would probably just sit it out. I don't want to be rude and walk out. But if it's a lot of times with technical conferences, you'll have a session that's maybe an hour and a half and that's broken into 5 20-minute presentations. And then I would just be sure to leave in kind of that in between area where two presenters are switching out and pulling up their presentation. I think that's a good time to leave. But personally, I try not to leave in the middle of somebody speaking just because, opening and closing the doors, it's distracting. And I would rather sit there for a little bit and maybe later on it'll get better and I'll learn something new or something like that. But I would rather wait it out than be rude. But that's just me.
No, I agree with you, but I've recently read where people will say that it's okay, but I personally don't think it's, you know, I mean, if you can do it in a respectful way, like you said, like I think that's fine. But I think that just like, oh, I'm not, I'm out of here. Like I think that that
Yeah.
is really like a bad reflection.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of compare it to like if you were sitting in a class or in a lecture and you didn't like it. It would still be rude to like just walk out on your professor in the middle of the lecture. So, you know, I think too, when people are presenting, it's the act of public speaking is kind of a vulnerable act. And, I think I personally am not a big fan of public speaking. So, I always try to be as nice as I can be to the speakers because, it's hard to put yourself out there and get up and talk about something and, share your expertise and be judged by everybody in the audience. So, showing some respect and some grace and, just being kind, I think is important to anybody who's public speaking.
I agree.
Okay, so I think another aspect of conferences is exhibitors. Kind of depends on the conference, but with a lot of these leadership type conferences, there'll be maybe kind of like almost like mini career fairs or a bunch of exhibitors where you can meet with companies and graduate schools, maybe other IEEE organizations. Um, you know, what kind of advice do you have for students for how to best prepare for that aspect?
I think again, it's the same thing with like the sessions. It's like knowing who is going to be there and doing a little bit of homework up front because this is a great opportunity. Like you don't really get like FaceTime with recruiters. Usually you're sending a resume into the air and you don't know like what happens. So this is like a really great opportunity. So to actually be able to be in front of people. So you need to do a little homework, look up what that company does, um, see what's of interest, and then, if there's 50 people, but there's really only five that are of particular interest to you, then you're prepared to kind of target that instead of just kind of meandering around like aimlessly. So I think that's number one. Number two, make sure you have like your elevators pitched down. Like who are you? Can you say who you are, what you're interested in, why you're unique, what your future plans are, like can you do that in like under a minute? And if you can't, then it's good to practice that with your friends before you're in this situation. um you're in the case of our conferences, we do provide CVs to all of the people who might be at like a recruitment fair and all of that. And so sometimes they're actually looking for you too. So you need to make sure that you have maybe extra copies of your resume. So even though they get the resume book, it's always good to have some on hand. Um, and to, like I said, so make sure that you're dressed well, you shake someone's hand, you look them in the eye, you show some interest in their company or grad school or whatever. And it seems so intuitive, but it's really like not everybody does that, right? And so when you do, you stand out.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like same tips as career fair tips apply here. You know, like you said, maybe there's like five or so groups that you really, really want to talk to. And so making sure that you really prepare for those is good. I think it's also good to have one that is maybe like medium on your priority list. And so, you can do a couple warm up rounds where, you kind of work out the kinks in your elevator pitch, you get a little bit more comfortable. And then, the one that's like your number one, really, really want to talk to them, really want to get an internship with them or whatever. You've kind of like gotten more comfortable and warmed up before you go talk to them. I think that's kind of a good way to navigate it. And then too, if you really, really want an internship with somebody, I think the number one thing I heard from students going to career fairs is, well, I talked to them and they just told me to apply online. And the way around that is that you apply online before you go talk to them. So that if you know you really want an internship with company, whatever, do your research on them, maybe look at what job recs they have open, maybe apply to a few before you go talk to them. And when they tell you, hey, next step is to go apply online, you can say, oh, I already did. And that kind of fast tracks you up to the top because there's a lot of people who came up to them and said, what do you do? And you're already all the way up here. So that's kind of an insider tip of how you get around that is do it ahead of time.
Oh, great.
So, and I guess one other thing that comes to mind too with, talking with exhibitors is just be mindful of their time and everybody else's time. Especially in kind of those big exhibit hall kind of areas, there's a lot of people who want to talk to these different companies. So, making sure that you can have a conversation and do what you need to do, but also, don't just fill airtime and take up all the time because there's also a bunch of other students that want to talk to them and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you don't want to linger, you don't want to be the person who's just kind of, a hanger on in the booth and not someone who is just, succinct, gets to the point, makes your point, walk away on a high note.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think the next aspect then is just extending that. So other kind of networking tips, ways to kind of, make those connections throughout the conference. So do you have any recommendations for how people can kind of navigate that, meet some new people? I know it can be scary going to a conference with a bunch of people you don't know. So any ways to kind of make that maybe a little bit easier and approachable for people?
Sure. I mean, usually when you're at a conference, you're there because, you have a particular interest. So you're in a room with people who have the same interest or the same connection or the same background, or, in our case with HKN, everybody is, if you're a student, you're in a chapter. So you automatically have like some commonalities that are built in just by virtue of the fact that you're at the same conference together. So I think that right away is an automatic like kind of icebreaker where you can, start a conversation with things.
Mm-hmm.
Start a conversation in line to the buffet. Start a conversation, um, you know, during breaks. Make sure, at meals is another great time. Make sure you don't like just sit with people all the time, or if you do, because I know that that's like hard, um to sometimes, be alone at like every meal and stuff. Like if you're there with someone else from your chapter, make sure you just don't talk to each other. Like it's a big part of a conference is to have these opportunities to talk to people and to be open, to learn, I think some of the best learning at conferences occurs during like casual conversations with people. Talk to the speakers. Like wait till the session's over. Go up to the speaker and tell them like one thing that was your takeaway. Introduce yourself. There'll be like a lot of people at conferences. When you're a student that they're there because they want to meet you, like they want to meet students, and so it's kind of like yours for the taking, and it's a lower bar that you automatically have kind of a connection, through HKN.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's all really great advice. I especially like the sit with somebody new at lunch or something, or if even if you're there with one or two other people, those tables usually have 10 seats. So why don't you all go sit with a group of other people, and get to know them and make those connections, make those friendships, share ideas. Like you said, we have a lot of commonalities too at conferences, and those are great ways to start conversations too.
Yeah, and I mean, and if you feel awkward, guess what? So does everybody else. You're not like the only one. It's not like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
everybody else figured this out and I'm the only one who is feels awkward. Now everybody feels awkward. So it's like, where are you from? What are you studying? What are you interested in? How do you like with the place? What's something that you have learned here that surprised you? Like all of those kinds of things can lead to a conversation where you might make a connection, you might learn from the person, you might end up marrying them. Who knows? Like, you have to be okay with feeling a little uncomfortable and working your way through it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, this kind of leads into our next point of just reflection. So, taking all these connections that you make, all these learnings that you have from going to all these sessions, how do you then, kind of reflect on that, and make sure that you're, I guess, extracting the most. That seems a little bit, I don't know, maybe not the right wording, but you know, taking time to really like solidify those learnings and reflect on them, share them, turn them into actions. Maybe if you're, maybe if you're attending a session at the HCAN Student Leadership Conference about, alumni engagement with your chapter or something like that, turning that into something actionable afterwards. Do you have any tips for how students and or anybody can really, you know, turn what they learn into something that helps them go forward?
Yeah, I think another thing, but aside from the networking possibilities, I think one of the best things about going to a conference is you kind of disconnect from your normal routine and and you're taking in all this new information. So I think it's like really important that you build in time to jot down for like every session, like what were your key takeaways? Who needs to know this information? Because maybe you're attending something and, you're like, oh, my chapter president should know this. Or like, we want to try this idea. And so like taking notes throughout. And then I think you need to, as a team, have like touch points during the conference where you'll come together and you'll share and you'll say like, this was like, this guy was amazing, this guy, this woman was, I was blown away, or whatever it is. And to actually use the time during the conference, because you think you're going to do it when you get back, but when you get hit back with what we used to call the swirl, which is just like the everyday, like it's not going to happen because you're going to just go back to exams and papers and labs, and it becomes like even harder to do. So you really have to be, again, the word intentional comes to mind. You have to be intentional about capturing this, your learnings. And maybe you need to also, capture that. So if someone gave you funding, you can go back and say, this is what I learned. Thank you so much for,
Mm-hmm.
you know, providing me with this information. Tell us at HKN we work so hard to do planning for conferences, and tell us what you're coming away with. I mean, there's usually also conference evaluations, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
people are like, just checking boxes just to try to go through it as soon as they can. But most of the time, a conference evaluation is asking you this type of information. So use that as a tool to capture some of your takeaways. Because if you don't do it at the conference, when your normal life comes back, it's 10 times harder. And
Yeah.
then, it will dissipate, and all those good ideas and all those things that you wanted to do, it becomes harder to do. So I would say, you know, write notes and meet with your group, and maybe even like draw up some tentative plans, or at least like sketch out like, big ideas
Yeah.
at the conference.
Right. Yeah. And those are all things that I kind of do myself too when I would attend conferences, like making sure to take some notes, even at technical conferences, you go to a session and you hear somebody talk about something, you're like, oh, this would be a great thing for, Alex to apply to his research. I'm going to make sure that I tell him about this because I think it's a great idea and it'll really help him. Or, oh, that's really interesting. Maybe I can apply that to my work when I get home. But if you don't write those things down, it's easy to just forget it and have it go over your head and out of your brain as soon as you step on that plane on the way home. Um, I think too, maybe schedule a debrief kind of meeting before you even go to the conference. Like you said, once you get back the swirl of everyday life, it's hard to set up a time, but you already have something on your calendar and okay, next week, Tuesday, we're gonna sit down and we're gonna kind of talk through what we learned and make some plans. Then it's already on your calendar and it's a little bit easier to kind of hold yourself accountable to that and kind of create action out of all those things that you learned or put it all into practice. So yeah, I think these are all kind of great tips and great ways to, you know, capitalize on what you're learning. You're going here, you're taking the time, make sure that it's not just 2 days, you can apply this later on as well. And I think that also kind of pulls into other aspects of conference follow up. So, we kind of talked about making plans or, following up with people. Things even like making sure you connect with people on LinkedIn after you get back. Are there any other things that you think people should do kind of post conference to follow up and kind of round out the experience?
Sure. I mean, I think that, we touched a little bit on it. Like if anybody helped you to get to that conference, like make sure you, close that loop and write a thank you and like what your takeaways are. Let your, faculty advisors know, let your professors know, let your chair, let your dean, like they love to hear from students. Like students sometimes don't realize that, they think like, oh my God, I don't want to bother someone. They're so busy or whatever. But that's like, I mean, I worked at the university for many years. We live for that. We love to hear that. So I think that that's a great thing to do. Definitely like LinkedIn is a way to be able to have access to people that, you wouldn't normally have access to and just say like, hey, I attended your talk on, such and such, and it was really terrific. And, I'm thinking about going to, the same school that you went to. Can you, offer any tips on that? Or, things like that, I think go a long way. And, you know, and like I said, like if you have action steps to make sure that you capture those and you start to actually, work towards putting some of the things that you learned at the conference into practice.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think, some of these things also apply when we consider virtual conferences as well. You still want to follow up. You still want to, take the opportunity to connect with people that you met or you saw speak. Um, you know, are there any other things that you think, when it comes to virtual conferences, other types of tips or, does all this stuff still apply? What are some of the similarities and differences in terms of making the most of a virtual conference versus an in-person conference?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest mistake that people make is that they think of a virtual conference as kind of this passive activity. Like, I'm there. I got my computer on. It looks like I'm there, but I'm not. I'm on my phone, or maybe I'm even on another computer doing work or whatever, and that it's just kind of on in the background. And I think that's a mistake because I think that really a virtual conference offers you opportunities to hear from people who you might not be able to in an in-person conference because of distance, because of their celebrity speakers and they, will do a virtual conference, but they might not have time to come to speak at an in-person one. So a lot of times you have access to people who you might not ever have access to. And I think the same thing applies. Like if there's a recruitment fair, making sure you've done your homework, like there's usually networking opportunities within a platform. So, taking advantage of that, learning the platform, like maybe going in ahead of time and kind of figuring out the technical aspects. Can I log on? Am I having any issues with my computer, my connection, like figuring that stuff out ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's all really great advice. And one thing that comes to mind for me too is just like you mentioned, kind of that active participation still being important for virtual conferences. And I think it carries over to in-person conferences too. I think there's a lot of power in being the person to ask a question, especially I think at student-driven conferences or, even on campuses when you have an info session with a company. If you're the person who raises their hand and asks that speaker a question, that's if you're interested in getting a job with their company or really like connecting with them, having been the person to ask questions when everybody else was afraid to, that's going to help you stand out so much. Even in my personal experience, going to some of these virtual conferences, asking questions during the session, then I got direct messages from the people who were speaking saying, hey, be sure to come by our recruitment booth. We really want to talk to you more. So there's a lot of power in kind of putting yourself out there a little bit and being the person to ask the questions that really helps you stand out, I think, especially at student conferences.
Absolutely. Being that person who's engaged, whether it's virtual or in
Yeah,
person, is the key.
yeah, definitely. And you can even come up with a couple kind of, basic questions before you even go to a session and, things that you can tailor and kind of tweak depending on the session, have some stock questions in your back pocket just in case you can't think of anything else on the spot. I think that's another way to approach it and make it a little less scary if you kind of know, what you could ask before you even go. But okay. So I think we've talked a lot about different aspects of conferences. We've covered a lot. Is there any other things that you think people should know? Anything that we maybe missed?
Oh my God, that's a tough one. We talked about so much. I mean, simple things like being on time, I think is like one that maybe, that seems like so obvious, but is not. Um, I think have fun and just know that this is a once in a lifetime experience oftentimes, and that the connections that you can make can be lasting. In the case of student conferences, these are your future colleagues, and you don't think you will, but it's a small world, and you will see people at other conferences. You will see them, especially in the field, or if you're connected to IEEE, you will get to, this is your group, your network. So to just kind of take it like that. And for me, I always like to have fun too.
Yeah, I think this has been a really great conversation. I think we've covered a lot. I think I can't think of anything else to add. So, thank you so much, Amy, for joining us on this episode and for sharing your insight and helpful tips. I hope this is really helpful to future conference attendees. Hopefully we'll all see you too at future HKN conferences.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. So, if you want to catch up with HKN or learn more about our upcoming conferences, great place to go is our website, hkn.org, and you can also follow us on social media. So, thank you all again and have a wonderful weekend.